Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Cave Across Apologetics. I am Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're kind of just at the middle of our first halfway point for J.P. Moreland's Scientism and Secularism, Learning to Respond to a Dangerous Ideology. And what we've done kind of so far is define scientism. Scientism is, of course, differentiated from science. And if the people in the YouTube comments would actually click on a video rather than just looking at what they think the title of the short clips are, they might come to a different conclusion of what we're talking about. And he defines scientism as this idea that, well, there's technically, he kind of will talk about here two different types of scientism, a hard and a soft. And he describes it as this
weak and strong or something.
Yeah, exactly. As this idea that kind of science holds all the answers of everything, and anything that isn't able to be attributed to kind of those ideas that are the natural sciences, everything else can kind of be thought of as relativistic or up to personal ideas and interpretations, but those are split two different realms. So if you're talking about morality, you're in the area of chocolate ice cream versus vanilla ice cream, my go-to. But if you're talking about the way the neutrinos move, then they're there. Well, problem with that we've been seeing is that there are some times where the scientists want to dip their toe into the areas where they would probably agree that they can't dip their toes in, but they have a lot of things to say about it. And they say it with the air of science behind them. And
but
that's
it's a philosophical argument.
Exactly.
And the other problem is you might even like strawberry.
Right. Yeah, we're outside the binary at that point. There's more than 32 flavors there. So that's what Moreland's talking about, and he's kind of has defined his terms. He's given examples that we've talked about in previous chapters, and you can go back to all those on caveofthecross.com and click on the book. I added all the stuff. You click on the book, and all the cover photos for each individual episode are there. So you just pick the one that you want to be on, and you can watch or listen from there, or of course catch it on whatever platform you're watching or listening here. So moving into chapter 4 is where we're at, and it's kind of a short one for us, but of course we don't talk about everything that's in the book. We don't provide all the examples. The flow of the conversation that Moreland makes is always very concise, to the point, and well organized, and he makes promises that he fulfills, that he talks about. He talks about a story of kind of leaves you hanging for a couple chapters, but he does come back to it and all those things. So you can pick up the book in any of the links below as well. But chapter 4 here is talking about that scientism is a self-refuting. And he starts out on chapter 4 saying that strong scientism holds that only knowledge or rationality justified beliefs we can have about reality are those that have been certified by, and especially, the hard sciences. So again, we're talking about kind of two different types of people that hold to scientism. One that says that, nope, only the certified hard sciences are the only things that can give you truth that you can bank on. And everything else is shifted off to the side. The soft ones will come along and say, well, there might be a few extra toppings that you can throw on your ice cream if you want. But here he's distinguishing and saying that the strong scientism holders are those that say only the hard sciences will give you kind of that justified truth. He says that he believes that strong scientism is self-refuting. It is self-referentially incoherent, meaning that it refutes or defeats itself, and he's going to define that charge before he defends it. And of course, there's no way to kind of titrate this, scratch test this, to break it apart into its elements. And so we are going to be dealing with philosophy, but to be fair, they did it first. So that's where we're going here.
Yeah, okay. So self-refuting, scientism is self-refuting. That's the claim of this chapter, right? And this idea that the only knowledge that we can have is from science, right? That's the basic idea. So how's it self-refuting? Well, before we get there, let's talk about what makes a statement self-refuting. That's where he goes to next, right? So he wants to make sure that we're clear what he means by self-refuting. So he says, these kinds of statements, self-refuting statements, have three features, he tells us. First, the claim establishes some requirement of acceptability for an assertion, such as having to be empirically verified or something like that. So there's a requirement that the assertion has to make in order to be acceptable, right? That's the basic idea. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, the claim places, notice this, itself in subjection to the requirement. So the claim is part, or at least under the subjection of the requirement, right? The claim is has to be evaluated with regard to the same requirement as every other claim, right? That's the basic idea. So we have a standard, right, and a requirement of acceptability. The claim falls under that requirement, and then thirdly, then the claim falls short. And here's the problem, right? The claim falls short of satisfying the requirement of acceptability that the assertion itself stipulates. So you make a claim, you say this is the standard that something has to meet, and this claim falls within that particular area, but that particular claim fails to meet the standard that it's set for claims. So in other words, when a statement is included in its own subject matter, like when it refers to itself, thus self-referential, right, but fails to satisfy its own standards of acceptability, that's the idea of self-refuting, right? So he wants us to be clear on what he's talking about with regard to self-refuting statements.
Yeah. And here's where you get all the fun examples, the classic one that's probably already going out of the purview of conversation is there are no absolute truths. Are you absolutely sure? Or we can reach back even to biblical times or before biblical times. And I was reading Titus, and Paul quotes, that all Cretians are liars. And that comes from Epimenides, who himself is a Cretan, so, a person from Crete. So if a Cretan tells you that all men are liars and he's a Cretan, well, therefore he's lying, right? Or is he telling the truth? Yeah. So there you get the liar's paradox as well. And so you go. Right. Yeah. You stick it into a Muppets Jim Henson movie, and you make $1 million.
You make a lot of money.
Exactly. All right. Well, so we've defined our terms again. Always a great thing to do. And he goes on to say that self-refuting statements can come in many forms. And so he gives us a further example. So all sentences are exactly 3 words long. And of course, that sentence is not 3 words long, but it is a sentence. So it is self-refuting. It puts itself under, it makes a claim, right? And so there you have all 3 aspects. Another one, I cannot utter a word of English, spoken in English. You get this in your cheap 80s comedies, no habla inglés, but you were just talking English. It's like, no, I wasn't. Yes, you were. So the back and forth there. The claim that I do not exist. Descartes would blow his gasket over that claim. This sentence is false. Again, that liar's paradox. And again, all 3 conditions are met here. Truths can only be verified by 5 senses or by science. If we look closely at these sentences, we'll see
that
how
one is really close.
Yeah,
right. That one's really close to it, right? In
right.
fact,
Yeah. So we sniff this sentence, we sniff this truth, and it's true. So, or we can lick it. The snozberries taste like snozberries, or by science. So we can do all the things of science, and that's the only way we get the truth. So we'll see how each satisfies the criteria of being self-refuting.
Right. So he wants us to be clear here. And so he says that some statements like 6 + 3 = 17, right, could not possibly be true. Right. He says, this is a necessary falsehood. So even God, he says, could not make 6 + 3 = 17 true. Right. He says other statements like there are no cats only happen to be false. Right. They just happen to be false, but these could have been true. So they're, contingent. Right. And so those are not self-refuting. Notice he tells us that here the key to remember is that self-refuting statements do not just happen to be false. Instead, they are necessarily false. They must be false, right? And so no amount of future research will show that these statements are true after all. And so he wants to prevent the scientists from saying, well, if we could just get enough research, or eventually we'll be able to show that. Right. He says, no, they're necessarily false. All right.
Right. So yeah, the kind of the example of, if it's raining outside, then the grass will be wet. You go outside and the grass is wet, and then you go, therefore it was raining. Although the sprinklers had been turned on previously. So is it self-refuting? No, but it was wrong. Could it have been otherwise? Could it have been raining at some point in time? Well, yes. And therefore, it doesn't make this could not possibly be true. But the fact that, the ground is wet and there are the answer to that question is within range of possibilities. Some of them can be true or false. 6 + 3 = 17. which again should be 9, it can't be anything but 9. Out of all the possible numbers in the entire world, you just happen to pick the one right one. And so yes, that happens to be the case. And so it can't be anything but that. So those are kind of the two ideas. And again, we kind of throw out these claims a lot of times. The person who's heard some of these charges, well, that's self-refuting, that's contradictory. You're using terminology, but you're using it in a different claimant category, more of a popularist. You're just wrong, and I'm trying to sound a little bit more smart in this. All right, so why strong scientism is self-refuting is this section that we're moving on to.
Right, so now what he's going to do is kind of apply this whole discussion to the claim of scientism, right? Yeah.
Right. So to test our understanding, is the following statement of strong scientism self-refuting? So here's the claim. Only what is testable by science can be true.
Okay.
All right. So there's 3 criteria that we have to check. So we'll see if it's self-refuting. Does the statement establish a requirement of acceptability? Only what is testable by science can be true. Yes. It says that something must be testable to be true.
There you go. Number 1, check. Right.
Right. There's your claim. Does this statement place itself in subjection to the requirement? Again, the statement, only what is testable by science can be true. Well, yes, it purports to convey truth, right? That statement, only what is testable by science can be true, is attempting to be a true statement. It's expressing what must be the case.
So there's number 2 checked up.
So does the statement then fall short of satisfying its own requirement? All right, so only as what is testable by science can be true. Let's test it by science, that statement. Well, yes, this is a philosophical statement about science that cannot itself be tested by science. Therefore, one must conclude that it must be, can't otherwise not be self-refuting.
Self-refuting. There it is, right? So notice what he has shown here is that the claims of scientism are philosophical claims and not scientific claims, right? That's what he's trying to show here, right? And so he says not only is strong scientism false, but it's self-refuting. In addition, nothing will ever be discovered. Again, he gets back to this point because he doesn't want somebody to come back and say, well, you give me enough time and I'll show that, No. Nothing can be discovered that can change this. He says no amount of future research or blockbuster discoveries can show that a self-refuting statement was true after all.
Right.
All right? No, that's not going to work. And so he tells us that the irony is that strong scientism is a philosophical statement expressing an epistemological viewpoint about science. It is not a statement of science, right? Like, for instance, water is H2O or cats are mammals. It is a philosophical statement, of about science. And so it is not a scientific statement. So strong scientism, he tells us, is a philosophical assertion that claims that philosophical assertions are neither true nor can be known. Only scientific assertions can be true and known. So notice, strong scientism says that philosophical statements don't fit the criteria for truthfulness, and therefore they they don't give us knowledge and they're false. Well, the statement of strong scientism is a philosophical statement, and therefore it doesn't fit, and therefore it can't be true. That's what he's talking about here, right?
Right.
And so he tells us that Christians, therefore, should not be intellectually intimidated when they hear very smart people, right, with advanced degrees sitting in positions of authority say things that, end up being self-refuting.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And even still, cats are mammals, but then you throw out the platypus and you have a mammal that lays eggs and has all sorts of weird affectations to its details. And you just go, well, I think the platypus was God's design to throw off our classification system just by 1 degree. So there's that.
You don't say God doesn't have a sense of humor.
That's right. Well, chapter 4 is essentially kind of that, and we're kind of skipping over a number of items here, but moving on to chapter 5, that scientism is the enemy of science is what we're going to be covering for the majority of this episode and the next episode. And he starts off by saying, neither form of scientism, neither its strong nor its weak version. Again, a strong will say, only science will give you truth claims. A soft scientism says there might be various other ways that we can sneak in truth claims into our our
Right.
science here.
But science has to judge those. It can judge those whether or not they are true. Right.
Right.
So it does make science then, the final arbiter
Right.
of truth.
Exactly. So neither form of scientism adequately allows one to state and defend the necessary presuppositions that justify practicing science. So in chapter 4, he's highlighted one of the fundamental ironies of this discussion, namely that scientism is not science, but it's philosophy, right? You're not able to do science on that statement, and therefore we move from the category of science, the hard sciences, to one of epistemology or of philosophy, our act of knowing, our ability to know things. If we can know things. Can we know things? Well, that itself is a question that we can ask, and to ask it means that we can probably know things, right? So that's the fun part about philosophy. So now we can go a step further and say that not only is scientism not science, again, as defined by the scientists themselves, it is not even a friend of science, but rather its enemy. And therefore, the danger sneaks in here of the subtitle.
Yeah. So scientism kind of, if you hold to that position, it pretty much destroys science, right? Because now it's saying that, the statement of scientism is false. And therefore, what does that do to science, right? So that's what he means, I think, by its enemy here. That's part of what he means. All right, he goes on then, and he wants to now kind of zero in on the philosophical presuppositions that science has to adhere to, or at least hold to, in order to, accomplish the things that it accomplishes. And so he entitles this section, "The Conclusions of Science Can Only Be as Strong as Its Presuppositions," right? The assumptions that the scientists are making. And so he says that science cannot be practiced in thin air, right? It's based on many assumptions, each with its challenges. And so the business of stating and criticizing and defending its assumptions, notice, is not scientific, but philosophical. Right. And so what he's going to do in the rest of this chapter is to show that there are some assumptions and there's disagreement on these assumptions. And so on either side, you have to make philosophical arguments about these assumptions of science. And again, that is not doing science, that's doing philosophy. Right. Is what he's getting at.
Right. Yeah, science is not made ex nihilo in there. Well, just as the structure of a building cannot be more reliable than the foundation on which it rests, so the conclusions of science, the structure, cannot be more certain than the presuppositions of science, its foundations. You may have heard a time or two where we've made just that claim about pretty much everything else, and so we bristle at the whiskers for the underlying presuppositions of anything. But strong scientism rules out these presuppositions altogether, because the nature of the presuppositions is philosophical, just as defending the presuppositions is also a philosophical and not a scientific matter. Again, we covered that. It's self-defeating. In this way, then, scientism ends up losing the foundations of science itself, jeopardizing the entire edifice. One could almost say that it builds its house on sand and not on a foundation of, let me pull out like a rock or what have you.
Yeah, go figure, right? So the idea here is, let's say that we have the building of scientific knowledge claims, right? And then underneath that, maybe under the ground, are pillars that are holding up the building, right? And what he's getting at here is that the claim of scientism disregards, in fact, calls those pillars false, right? Because they're not scientific, they are philosophical. And if that's the case, then that seems somewhat absurd. So you're saying the foundation that holds up the building of science is false. Well, if that's the case, what does that do to the structure, right? It collapses, right? If the foundation, if what's holding up the pillars are false, then of course you don't have a good structure as well. And that's what he's getting at, right? And so he goes on. He says he's going to give us a list and discuss some of these presuppositions. So that's kind of interesting. In one of the books that he's written, he gives us, I think, like 10 of these, right? In this book, I think he only gives us like 6 or something, right? So we get cheated a little bit, but that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
And he says that not all scientists or philosophers of science agree with the entire list, right? And some do not think that science rests on presuppositions, but few would be in this latter category. most scientists he's suggesting believe that science does rest on these kind of presuppositions, these foundation pillars that need to be the case in order to get science off the ground, we might say, right? And so most advocates of scientism hold to a view of science that entails that science rests on most, if not all, of the assumptions that he's going to give us, right?
Yeah. So he says that he should also say that while he offers his own view about some of these assumptions, the issues before us is not which understanding of the assumptions is correct, e.g., which view of truth does science presuppose. And again, I point back to his introduction where he talks about starting out his life as a person who loves science, who still loves science, but then got into philosophy. So again, he's not diminishing the effectiveness of science, and he's calling for a more full understanding. But I think also to point out that he is the right person to kind of tackle this idea because of being able to offer kind of critiques or different claims within the list that he'll give us. The issues before us are these. One, the nature and content of the presuppositions are not scientific. They are philosophical. So the task of stating and clarifying each assumption is a philosophical and not a scientific one. Well, again, if you're strictly sole scientism, this one's going to be hard for you because you're not going to be able to even get off the ground. You're attempting to put the roof on to the house first, and that's not quite how it works. Two, the task of defending, criticizing, and offering alternatives to each presupposition is philosophical one and not within the competence of science. All right, well, we can't invite our scientism friends along for the first or the second task. Let's see if they'll be able to tag along for the third. The task of even arguing whether or not science rests on assumptions or on some specific one is not a scientific one either. It's philosophical. Unfortunately, when it comes then to, we must turn to the neighbors next door, the philosophers.
Yeah.
All right. So
what he's going to move on to is to now give us his list, right? So we should probably save that till next time.
That's right. Same bat time, same bat channel for the next portion of Chapter 5, exploring why scientism is the enemy of science. Well, we like science. Hopefully that's made clear here by, the idea. Hopefully it's worked its way out of the kind of amalgamation of pop culture that Christianity is against science. We just may disagree by what standard to sit it upon. And so hopefully that's made clear here, and you'll pick up the book, and we're moving quick, right? It's not one of our big books, but it does offer us some philosophical claims that, especially in the later portion of this chapter, you might benefit from reading along with us. And so we invite you to do so. And you can always check out the past episodes on caveofthecross.com or on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, Spotify, wherever else. So we hope you do, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.